Hello, everyone, and welcome back as we wrap up Chapter 7 on the Industrial Revolution. Previously, we talked about the birth of capitalism and how it really created opportunities for people in many parts of the world, particularly in Europe, but how it also led to some very poor working conditions that led to our first labor unions and pushes for reform. So now we'll be looking at two different economic philosophies largely born from the same concept. Please title your notes for today: The Rise of Socialism and Communism. So, just to get us started, we're going to begin by talking about socialism. And it's important to understand that in a modern context, in the world of politics and partisanship that we currently live in, the idea of socialism, even more so communism, are hyper polarized and looked at in the most radical sense. When we learn about socialism in terms of like its beginnings, it obviously is going to look very, very different. So, as we've looked at previously, the Industrial Rev opens up this massive gap between the rich and the poor. Think of Jacob Ries's How the Other Half Lives, and those photographs really showcasing these lives of profound poverty, while on the other hand, having these titans of business, these robber barons, accumulating just an absurd amount of wealth. So, business leaders believe that government should stay out of business affairs. This is capitalism 101, laissez faire, hands off. Reformers, on the other hand, believe that government needed to address societal problems. And this is really where socialism comes into play. So workers are demanding more protections, more rights. These will become labor unions. But socialism provides a means of really providing that. So Robert Owen is the founder of a Scottish mill that basically relies on this utopian idea of socialism. He's stunned by the poor working conditions of laborers all across Europe. And in his mill, he tries to improve the lives of his employees. So he creates child labor laws. No children can work under the age of 10. There are schools on site. Work days are limited to 8 hours, and there is a minimum wage. All of these concepts are socialist, where the government essentially, or him in this case, an outside force, is interfering in standard business practice. Right now, the minimum wage is a big argument going on. Setting a minimum wage by the government, again, would be a socialist principle. Minimum wage, or like the concept of minimum wage in capitalism, would be regulated by the market, not by this outside force. This is a photograph of Owen's mill. They actually didn't last very long. This was actually in New Harmony, Indiana, in one of the communities that he created. And it was basically predicated on this idea of utopianism, where everyone could survive and live good lives if they put in the work for it. So just some additional things about socialism. In the core basic principles of it, the government is supposed to regulate the economy rather than businesses. This is a big contrast to laissez-faire, let do, hands off. This is very much hands-on by comparison. Main industries that are a public need to people, like schools, transportation, the postal system, are controlled by the government. You'll notice many of these things are like this in American society today. And then other smaller industries can still be owned by the private sector. This is supposed to promote equality. In communism, everything is owned by the government. There are no private businesses, and everything essentially is commandeered, taken, and redistributed. So just to draw a little bit of historical connection here, let's take a quick look at the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash in 1929. So you can see here, these are the stock trends, obviously, in this time period. You can see the massive fall off in that year. And just to take a very quick look at it, during that time, we had these massive bank runs after the so-called Black Tuesday, the day the stock market crashed. And people surged toward the banks. They pulled out all their money, and it caused, obviously, economic depression. It's important to understand that when you put your money into the bank, they only keep a very small portion of it actually in their coffers, and everything else is invested or loaned out to other people. So when people go to pull all of their capital out, all of their money, it causes the banks to fail and ultimately close. There was no protection for people's money at the time as well, so like you weren't insured. So if your bank failed, you could literally lose all of your money. So in capitalism, a capitalist would argue that this follows a boom-bust cycle. This is simply a recession, this is a trough, and then eventually there will be a recovery, the market will self-correct, and things will get better. The problem, though, becomes in the meantime, people are starving. They're in bread lines, they can't find jobs, they can't afford food, their family could be sick, and there becomes this need for the government to interfere or get involved. During this time period, we end up with a Democratic president, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who creates a New Deal agenda in America. He calls for 3 Rs: relief, recovery, and reform, and basically creates government programs to put Americans back to work. This would be a socialist ideal. This is the government interfering in the private market to try to make people's lives better and to create more equality, to better regulate wealth. Again, by contrast, in laissez-faire, the government would do nothing and the market would self-correct. Just as a little bit of additional information, there were several American presidents, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, who believed in a concept called rugged individualism, which basically argued that people needed to, fend for themselves essentially and have like this grit to persevere and push through, and that eventually the market would correct. Those presidents became profoundly unpopular, though, as the American people continued to suffer. These programs provided relief. It's important to understand the New Deal does not fix the Great Depression. That is America's involvement in World War II and the massive production that's needed for war materials, but it's still an important connection regardless. Just to show you a couple very quick comparisons, take a very quick look at this chart. You can see on the left-hand side, these are some principles of capitalism. Individuals, businesses own property, means of production. Socialism, the government owns the most important industries. Self-interest is the central force of capitalism. Common good is the central force of socialism, and so on. So if you would, please pause the video here and take a quick look at primary source A. This is from the Communist Manifesto, which was originally composed by Karl Marx, the father of communism, and his companion Friedrich Engels. Engels was the primary architect and author of the Communist Manifesto, but this really becomes the basis or backbone for what communism becomes. So again, pause the video here and then answer these two questions that follow. Number one, how did Marx and Engels describe the history of human society? And number two, what were the two classes both authors felt society had developed into, and how did these classes feel about one another? So just to very quickly go over this together, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx defined all of human history in this idea of conflict theory, that there have always been these essential conflicts that drive humanity, and it's almost always tethered to the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, people doing well and people who are not doing well. And they said that basically throughout all of society, whether it is during the Renaissance or the feudal era or the French Revolution, this is basically been the catalyst for everything we've experienced. And they say that over time, what's going to begin to happen is the factory owners will become so wealthy and everyone else will become so poor that it will create such a profound imbalance that the poor will rise up, the proletariat, and they'll overthrow the bourgeoisie. And what will be left is this classless society where everybody does well and everyone succeeds. So you may be thinking that Marxism, communism is kind of like a pipe dream, sounds good in theory, but isn't really that practical. Communism really evolves over time and becomes even more, seen in a very negative light in the examples that follow, particularly in the cases of China and the Soviet Union. So just to have some quick notes about, what Marxism is, founders, two German guys, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they introduce radical socialism or an extreme form of socialism in writing the Communist Manifesto. Just to get it down, conflict theory argues all societal issues are based on wealth gaps between the social classes, the haves or the bourgeoisie, and the have-nots, the proletariat. So according to Marx and Engels, again, eventually the wealthy will drive the middle class out of business and we'll end up with these massive industries. And the proletariat will become so large and so massive that they'll overthrow the bourgeoisie and we'll be left with this classless society where everyone can succeed and everybody does well and there is no poverty, there's no hunger, there's no inequality. So think of communism as a form of complete socialism where rather than just the important industries being controlled by a government, all production is. Mines, factories, railroads, small businesses, they're owned by the people. And again, this is a little bit convoluted. So the idea would be that everything is commandeered by the government, taken, and then redistributed according to need. So it doesn't matter how hard you work or what job you have. Everyone gets what they need to survive, whether you're a brain surgeon or you're a garbage collector or a teacher or a dentist. It makes no difference. Everyone gets what they need to survive, and there's this blanket equality. Capitalists would argue, on the other hand, that removing incentive would cause society to collapse or breed corruption. During this time, we also have pushes for reform in the form of labor unions. Ned Ludd was like a fictional character during this time. Because production was advancing so quickly, we had a lot of people's jobs being phased out, particularly the Luddites. And these people were basically industrial workers who, because they were so frustrated with the Industrial Rev, were sneaking into factories at night and destroying them, literally throwing their wrenches into machines, hence the common phrase, you've thrown a wrench in it to destroy something or make something fall apart. So just to have this down in your notes, a union is essentially a group of workers who are calling for reform. Their power comes in the form of collective bargaining, or basically adding all these voices together to negotiate. And their ultimate power is to strike, to refuse to work until negotiations are made. This is typically seen as a last resort. In many industries at this time, it did nothing because they would simply replace you if you weren't doing your job or not doing what the employer wanted. But unions do become extremely powerful over time. In U.S. History 1, you'll talk about American labor unions and how they become a massive force in terms of negotiating political policy and legislation. This is a quick chart just to see the differences between capitalism, socialism, and communism. This will be useful to you in the chapter assessment. And just to wrap things up very quickly, in the coming chapters, we're going to be looking a lot at this political spectrum. It gives a good indicator for how modern political parties line up with these ideas. You can see to the extreme left, it would be communism. To the extreme right would be fascism. And then socialism and conservative are kind of to the middle. And then you can see the Democratic and Republican Party in the political spectrum there as well. In our next chapter, we're going to transition into imperialism, and you'll see how these two chapters are very much linked together. This new need for raw materials in the Industrial Rev is going to drive the search for raw materials in foreign lands, hence imperialism.